Okay, here's some buffing tips for you. When you first start learning how to buff, one of the most common problems is burning through. And that's either sanding through or burning through with your buffer. And that's going to happen on your edges because if you're sanding and buffing on a flat area, when you hit that edge, it's usually raised, it's higher, so you're sanding, a lot more material off those edges than you are on the center of these areas. So one tip before you start sanding or buffing or anything is to tape off your edges and body lines, and that'll prevent any sanding or buffing. Another thing to remember, when sanding, you might not try to sand every little thing on the car. For example, if this area here looks good and it doesn't need buffing, you may consider not buffing it. Because you got to remember, anywhere that you sand, you're going to have to buff. And if it's hard to get in here with the buffer to buff these areas, you're not going to be able to get your sand marks out. So if it looks good, you may consider, does this area need buffed or not. There's not too many hard areas on this hood, but there are some real panels that have a lot of concave areas. It makes it hard to buff. So if it needs it, if you got a run or some trash, dirt in that area, you may have to, but you may be able just to denib that spot, and we'll talk about that in another video. So masking your edges and considering if you need to buff in that area before you ever start sanding. So if you're going to mask the edges, not recommended if you're starting to buff, you just go over your edges about 1/4 of an inch or so. Chuck it down real good where it doesn't come off. And also this edge here, I've masked that off. Any body line. I've masked that off before ever starting to buff. And you'd go around and do the whole area like that, and especially if there's any adjacent panels. This is setting on the car, you'd certainly want to mask off the next panel next to it. Now when you tape this, you're going to have some sand marks and buff marks up against this tape, and this may require, after you take the tape off, a little bit of hand buffing, to smooth that out. It's going to take a little bit of effort to do that. Now, if you're not wanting to tape, you can be careful and, like I said, maybe not even sand these edges if it doesn't need it. Therefore, you won't need to buff those edges. And another tip, if you are buffing on edges, it's very important. You always want this edge to be coming off the panel. So you want this edge to roll off. That way it doesn't take off near as much material. If you kind of got it tipped to this edge, see how that's pushing on that panel, and you're more likely to burn through doing that. So always position yourself in the buffer to where it's always pushing off the edges. And still be very careful and buff the edges as little as possible. But always make sure it's going off the panel. Now in the video where I demonstrated how to use the DA, that's a quicker, much easier, faster, and produces excellent results. But if you don't have a DA, you can wet sand this, color sand it. And you may hear buffing referred to a lot of things. Color sanding, buffing, cut and polish. It's all basically the same thing. But you can use wet sand, and they've got up to 2,000, 2,500 grits, I believe. I haven't used the wet sanding method in quite some time, but you can do that. It just takes a little bit longer, and but still achieves, you can get really nice results from wet sanding. Another tip, whenever you are sanding, whether it's wet sanding or with a DA, check your progress frequently. Whatever the coarser grit is that you're going to be using first, for example in that video we used 15, check it, and as soon as everything's flat, all the dirt heads are smooth, all the orange peel's gone, then start cutting back to your other grit. There's no need to keep going with that grit. And make sure that you sand enough with the other grits to minimize those scratches. And another tip, you can see that buffing is quite a dirty job. I mean, it slings stuff on you. They make aprons you can wear, that you can put on, do your buffing, take the apron off. That'll keep you much cleaner. And some people's asked me about it and gets this confused. Is you're not supposed to, after a new paint job, you're not supposed to wax your car for 90 days. But wax contains silicones, which you don't want on there. That seals off the paint and doesn't allow it to properly cure. Most paint companies recommend 90 days, 3 months for the paint to cure before waxing. But compounds and polishing is not a waxing process. The best time to do this, in most cases, normal shop conditions, is the next day. Before the paint gets too hard, it's a little bit easier to buff. You don't want to do it too quick when the paint's real fresh, but generally the next day, unless you're a production shop and baking it, to get the cars out really fast or using some type of speed clear. But most conditions the next day, but you do need to be careful with the paint. It is still soft. When washing it, you don't want to be using a dirty mitt or anything like that, because it's going to scratch easier and put swirl marks easier, for that 90-day period. After that, it's fully hardened. You have less chance of getting swirl marks in it. But a lot of people ask me, do I have to wait 90 days before buffing? And the answer is no. The next day is the best time, but do not wax it for that 90-day period. Then after that 90 days, a coat of wax will protect the paint, protect it from contaminants, and it is a good thing, but you just need to wait that 90 days. Well, that's just a few extra tips that I wanted to go over with you, because I did have a question about edges, ways to eliminate from burning through. And again, tape your edges or stay away from them altogether, and consider the areas that need to be buffed. Does it need to be buffed? And make sure the buffer is always working off the panel. And another thing, if you're doing show cars or restoration or complete, buffing, you can buff however much you want to. But you also got to think of it, OEM, brand new cars from the factory have a certain amount of orange peel from the factory. They don't have that show quality look. Now you'll need to buff it enough to knock some of the dirt nibs down and level some of the orange peel. But if you go and sand that to that show quality and get it completely slicked out, and you're just doing that to one panel, it may not match the rest of the car. So you might consider that if you're working, trying to do a job that matches and make that invisible repair. You may consider how much that you buff it so that it has the same texture as the rest of the car. Well, I hope these tips helped. If you have any questions, go down and leave a comment below. Be sure and give us a thumbs up and share this with your friends. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time. If you'd like to see the full buffing tutorial, be sure and click right here.